Hello, you are here with Deanna from Hot for History and Alexander Canducci, who's an amazing author of The Greatest Lies in History, Spin, Doublespeak, Buck Passing, and Official Cover-Ups That Shaped the World. And I'm really excited to have you today. And the way that I found you was that I got your book. And everybody, there will be a link here. I love this book. I even love the way it feels. But I went online because people love history, and they're not even a historian like you are. And I'm going to read sort of all of, everything that you've done in a second, but they're fascinated by it, but they're always so sure that they're right and you're wrong. And there's always this debate. Like even the other day we were talking about corsets, and it's like, no, corsets aren't like that, so it's just the way it is. So Alexander Canducci is a former academic from Sydney, Australia, who has written 2 general history books, The Greatest Lies in History and Triumph and Tragedy, The Rise and Fall of Rome's Immortal Emperors. His most recent work is a 2022 paper titled The Roman Withdrawal from Britain 410 or 435, A Fresh Perspective. Published in the Journal of Ancient History and Archaeology, he is currently working on a new paper about the location of the lost tomb of, is it Scipio Africanus?
That's correct. Yes, Scipio Africanus. Yes,
the conqueror of Hannibal, which sounds amazing. I can't wait to see that.
It is. It's fascinating that nobody knows exactly where Scipio's buried. There are hints in the histories about where because basically after all of his victories, he disappeared. He went to a little town in the south of Italy because basically he was thrown out of Rome by his political enemies. And he basically turned his back upon Rome and said, "Stop, all of you. You can all, take care of yourselves." And he just went into exile. But we don't know exactly where he's buried. So, as I said, there are hints, and we'll look at exploring that a little bit later. So when I get around to that, that'll be fascinating. Right
now, we are going to discuss the hidden agenda of America's founding fathers, and I also just want to address this chapter because I've often felt like, and especially in recent history, how the narrative and what we believe, our patriotic and national, faith that we have, is oftentimes based on propaganda and lies. And this book is about the greatest lies in history. And so you have a chapter in here called The Hidden Agenda of America's Founding Fathers. And you say the lie is the founding fathers were morally driven men. So can we dive into the lies and the truth with that and what you discovered regarding that? Because we really do. We think, I do. I'm really like, okay, well, they came over here. They wanted to escape the tyranny. They wanted free speech. They wanted to be able to write what they wanted to write, freedom of religion, and no taxation. And we certainly didn't want what we had in England, which was this monarch and this hierarchy, right? In social circles. So what have you discovered about the truth and the lies?
Okay, so look, fundamentally, every nation has its foundation myth. That's just the way it is. It's important. It's a method by which you bind a people together to have a common understanding and a common goal, in essence, to say we are a shared people, we have a shared identity. The Romans had it with Romulus and Remus being suckled by the she-wolf. The Israelites have it, and the Jewish people have it through the foundation pact that Abraham has with God. Every culture has it, and in the US has it in with the founding fathers about this group of idealistic patriots who were so irate and incensed with the control and the unjust control what was being exercised by the British that they felt they had no choice but to basically free themselves from those shackles because they were denied their basic liberties. The reality is always somewhat more contested. Look, fundamentally, people are, you have all sorts of people. You have people who are genuinely altruistic. You have people who are just more self-centered, more egotistical. And the reasons why they do things will differ. The founding fathers themselves, they're different to you and I. Fundamentally, they had interests. And by and large, the founding fathers as a whole, as a collective whole, were an elite. They were a privileged elite. Most of them came from inherited wealth. that they built up over the generation. So yes, their grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever, had come across from England to flee a state church, which the English had through the Anglican Church. They had a state church, and they didn't want to be part of it, so they moved. But they created their wealth in America. But by the time you get to the Founding Fathers, much of it was inherited. And what drove a lot of their animosity and their unhappiness was that they had this wealth. They were important people within the colonies, but there was that recognition was not afforded them back in the home country, back in Britain. And by and large, at the beginning of the conflicts, and we were talking about the Prelude, the 1760s up to the 1770s, that they saw themselves as British. They did not see themselves particularly as American.
Yeah.
That conception only comes across when you finally decide we're breaking away from Britain. So if we're no longer British, what are we? But until that happens, they were British. So what they wanted was recognition and the ability to be like the elites in Britain, to be able to have a seat in Parliament, to have all the privileges that came with it. And of course, the British, the existing ones who were in Britain, they had no desire to share that. Why would they? Who are you? We can trace our ancestors back to Edward III and all of this rubbish. So that was a key aspect of what drove certainly the landowning classes in the colonies and the merchant classes. They had all of this wealth, whether it be physical wealth through the merchant classes or landed wealth through the landowning gentry. They wanted to do that. Now, the ultimate driver of this was the French and Indian War in 1754 to 63. So the British put in a lot of resources, a lot of taxation money went into supporting and keeping the French at bay. So that needed to be recouped, and the British, not unreasonably, said, well, look, it costs a lot of money for us to keep standing army to keep you safe from the French. You need to contribute. Like any wealthy individual, I don't like paying taxes. No wealthy individual likes paying taxes. No. It's a fundamental thing. It's universal. So they resented. So when they began their attempts to basically try to exert their own, or to emphasize their unhappiness by protesting the various acts, the Townsend Acts, the Intolerable Acts, they basically decided that we were going to take a stand and basically resist these what we consider to be unfair acts, because you're taking our money. We want our money. It's not yours. It doesn't matter that we're grateful that you came and kept the French at bay, but it's still our money. We want to do with it what we want. So that's how you get the first of those. So there were three large myths to the Revolutionary War. One is taxation without representation was tyranny. That famous quote. Mm-hmm. And that is the fundamental root of that is, as I said, that they felt that nobody had the right to take their money for whatever reason. The reason was largely irrelevant. That they would decide how my money was going to be. If you're going to be taxing us, then we want to be able to have a say. The problem is that there's a hypocrisy within that, because certainly by the time the Republic is founded, when you get to the Shays Rebellion in 1786-87, those farmers in Massachusetts, they also said, you're taxing us. We have no representation. And again, taxation without representation is tyranny. Well, of course, the Founding Fathers weren't going to see, other upstarts come along and take their status and say, no.
That's
So that whole thing was in essence a nice framing in terms of a catchphrase, which is a memorable catchphrase, but nonetheless, it is one of self-service. Right. So that's the first bit. Then we talk about the actual, as I said, the myth of the nobility of the Founding Fathers. So these were noble men, carrying out a noble, just cause. Look, some of them were, so Dr. Joseph Warren, who died at the Battle of Bunkers Hill, he was genuinely a man who with principles and concerns. And certainly he, of all of the Founding Fathers, was deeply concerned about the fact that a war with Britain would fundamentally weaken the colonies and weaken Britain to a point where the French could come in and take everything over. So he was genuinely concerned in terms of the bigger picture rather than this more narrow parochialism that drove the remainder. And George Washington himself was a remarkable man. He could, moving forward in time, after his second presidency, he could have, if he wanted to, have erected a military state because he controlled the army. So almost like a figure like Augustus, you control the armies, you can control what happens. He walked away from having that sort of power. That, in and of itself, is an interesting and a good snapshot into the mindset of certainly of George Washington. But many were not like him. Samuel Adams, for instance, is a classic example. Samuel Adams had this almost pathological hatred of the British, right? But partially due to his own father's failed banking venture, which sort of left him very embittered with the way the British operated and how they all did their business. So he would, he'd almost be like a modern YouTuber almost in some of the ways that he does things. He would concoct debates to try and inflame opinion. So he would write things under two different names to newspapers to say, here's a debate. I'll post these things as John Smith, and I'll post these things as Adam Smith. And he's having this fictitious debate with himself and trying to argue that, but of course the one that he wants is always the more sensible one, and the one that he writes under the alias are always much more inflammatory and anti the colonies. So he would distort events, and it's and fundamentally that's what drove much of that sort of polemic around it. Certainly after the war, the papers of the principal revolutionaries were destroyed. Like a sheer number of them were destroyed and removed from circulation. Other principal players refused to leave accounts of what actually transpired because they were hoping that the narrative that had been built up would make them seem righteous in the eyes of history going forward. But B, also, and to some extent, this is how they justified it to themselves, was that if we give this image of these almost more perfect individuals, then maybe others will follow and emulate them. Emulate the reasons why they did it, and have a succeeding generations who are going to be more noble and more understanding of what we were or what we say we were trying to do. So the nobility in and of itself is not true. And the classic example of how these things were distorted is the account of the cherry tree, George Washington and the cherry tree.
Yes.
Okay, that is a completely made up story. And the person who made it up wrote a biography of Washington and included numerous anecdotes that were just completely made up. And never happened. But again, because America was a secular state, right? It needed. So like the old countries of Europe, when they talk about having these figures from history, there's a lot of, and the good ones, the ones who you would look up to and say, these people we should emulate, they were all, lots of them were saints. Back in the 1700s, they were, the ones we're looking backward in time, they were all saints. America doesn't have any saints. So what you needed was secular saints, individuals who had exemplified the best of humanity. That's not who they were. But it was essential because you needed some way of binding, of getting people who are being dragged in the wake of the revolution. Because that's the other thing, the third and most important thing. The founding fathers do not represent the majority of colonists. They represented a small handful of people who had wealth and possessions, who were able to convince others that that their cause was right, that this is something that would be important. But the vast majority of colonists were basically eking out a living. Certainly in the North, they were eking out a living, and they didn't care one way or the other. In the South, it was even worse because the Southern plantation owners didn't, certainly in the beginning of the war, didn't give one iota about what was happening in the North. It didn't concern them because fundamentally they were more concerned with the Indians on their flank. And so weren't particularly interested in picking a fight with Mother England. So, but fundamentally, that's that whole aspect of the fact that they were a small subset of a larger population, and that they had agendas that they wanted to drive themselves. So, for instance, by 1778, so this is what, 3 years after Concord and Lexington. So by 1778, Britain was willing to concede sovereignty to the colonies because the British fundamentally did not really want to fight. So during the first part of the war, the first 2 or 3 years of the war, they deliberately instructed their generals to go easy on the various armies and the militia. Basically, give them a bit of a bloody nose, walk away, let them regroup, let them give time to think that they know they can't beat us, so therefore, they can work it out themselves. But unfortunately, the Founding Fathers, already having set this course, wanted to continue, till they'd achieved what they wanted, irrespective. And so, as I said, by 1778, Britain was willing to concede, but they said, no, we want to go. And what they actually wanted was additional territory. They wanted to go north. So part of the plans was to take parts of what is now Canada to be part of the American Republic. So they wanted additional land because fundamentally they're landowners. What do they want? We want to be able to purchase and buy more land and increase our wealth. So they kept on going to 1783. What changed in the Revolutionary War? What turned it from a somewhat restricted and constrained conflict to a broader one and more violent and more bloody and brutal was when the revolutionaries convinced the French to join their side. At that point, the British had to step up the game because fundamentally it was no longer a question of a group of individuals who just wanted some freedom from Mother England. This is now an imperial fight between the British Imperium and the French Imperium. So at that point, the conflict becomes far more bloody, far more brutal, and the atrocities that occur in the war start at that particular point. It didn't occur before, largely. It was fundamentally afterwards. And ultimately, that's a very important thing to remember, that that there were loyalists, but there were American colonists who were loyalists. Loyalists in this sense means they did not want to relinquish their allegiance to Great Britain. And so and like anything else, there was a small proportion of revolutionaries, of patriots, as we call them now, patriots, a small band of loyalists, and then 90% of the population in between who really just wanted to get on with their lives and didn't particularly care, who the master was going to be, because at some point there's going to be a master of, in terms of someone in higher up in the pecking order, because you got to remember back then, even though the colonies were slightly flatter than Britain, that elite status of this group still existed, landowning. And you got to remember when the revolution happens and it's successful and they set up the Republic, not everybody could vote. You had to have a certain level of land ownership to vote. So again, it was this self-perpetuating elite. So that's always the thing. And so therefore, this notion that we were defending liberty and everything else, and that the British were fundamentally, oppressive controllers who, we were minding our own business at Lexington, and all of a sudden the Redcoats come along and they start shooting at us because we're just milling around, minding our own business, perhaps throwing out 1 or 2 rocks at them. It's not quite right. Why were the Redcoats going to Lexington and on to Concord? Because they'd gotten reliable information that there were 3 siege cannons buried at Concord.
Oh.
Yeah. Siege cannons are not the sort of thing that a farmer would need. Fundamentally, why would a bunch of farmers who are sitting around having a lovely time being oppressed by the Redcoats need siege cannon? They don't. It's not even a defensive weapon. Cannons are not a defensive weapon, but siege cannons would be quite an essential piece of armory if you were wanting to blockade Boston Harbor. So this notion that it's sort of the revolution just flared up because we'd finally had enough of these British upstarts. They were killing us. They shot us, at Lexington. We had the Battle of Concord, and then, we need to defend our liberty, isn't quite right. There was a degree of pre-planning that there was going to be a conflict, and people like Samuel Adams desperately wanted the conflict because they did want to break away from Britain even before the gradual amping up of the various acts of parliament that Britain did that then triggered the bigger majority. So Yeah, so basically, that's a summation of it, really. Ultimately, as I said, the vast majority of people weren't invested one way or another. Certainly, the loyalists, the people the troops who supported Britain, were treated worse than what the revolutionaries treated the redcoats and the British regular forces. There were certain examples where they were completely massacred after surrendering. So, like the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780. That was the Patriots defeated a group of loyalists. They surrendered. They were massacred. And the corpse of their leader was mutilated after he died. So they basically mutilated him after he died. So there was this. So there's the brutalization of it. Just means that that these people were invested in getting a realm for themselves, and they were successful. They won. But as I said, the reality of it could not be advertised because it doesn't paint them in the best light. So what do? You craft the narrative that basically says, no, it's all about the nobility of it. It's about we were defending our freedoms. And as I said, that's what they had to do. And that's the way across history every winning group has done. It's precisely that.
It's so fascinating. Like when I hear you, I think to myself, wow, it's amazing how little has changed in a couple hundred years plus. One thing I remember hearing, like these things always surprise me, that actually there was a movement to try to convince George Washington to be king in America. Yes. Like they were contemplating a monarchy. Now that is not something they teach in the history books either. Like, they weren't like all about this, they were literally considering creating that system after leaving another system. That blows my mind. The other thing that I have to chuckle with is when you call Samuel Adams, like kind of like the OG YouTuber or whatever, because I can see how, because I also remember Ben Franklin, he would write he pretended to be this woman, Silence Dogood. I think she was like a widow. I think that was what her name was. And, to kind of promote what they were doing. So there were a group of very decent writers. Like they definitely loved to read, and they were philosophers in many ways, and they were really good writers. And they recognized early on propaganda. Like they understood how well, and obviously that had been going on also in England or whatever. But I think America, we see what we're dealing with today, like took it to a whole other level. And so when I say things have changed, but they haven't changed in the sense they needed to get people on board. How do they get people on board? They tell them a story. They tell them a story that sounds good, that's going to want to motivate them and move them to have an opinion and maybe make them mad. And if they have to lie or, as you put, double speak, pass the buck, cover up things, we're going to talk another time about forgery too. Like if they have to do that in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish, then they will. And so it's fascinating to see that all this time has gone by, but there's certain aspects of the foundations of America that still exist. Even this aspect of really, it's kind of about the money. It's not about, all the most noble things. And I think, our country, especially here in America, we're so we're so much more open to accept that now than we did. We all always embraced our, ambition in capitalist, like in being able to achieve our goals. But to know that at the very heart of our nation, it really was about, hey, can you make it to the top? Like, the survival of the fittest. But the one thing we don't really talk much about or in our history is this established hierarchy and this established social class. Like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington? Well, Samuel Adams, John Adams, they all went over to Europe constantly. They loved Europe. They loved staying in Europe. Like in the midst of all of this. And it was always like, we have to go there and we have to talk to them. We have to talk to the diplomats. We have to do the thing. Meanwhile, they're whining and dining and whatever. Then they'll go back and they'll, have a fight.
That's what they wanted. They wanted entry into that level of elitism And basically it showed, that they wanted to demonstrate that they were just as cultured and as important as the people in the old world. Exactly right. That drives much of it. And as you say, indeed, George Washington was offered the ability to be either a military dictator or a king, and he, as I said, definitely walked away from it.
Yeah.
But the tensions within the founding fathers themselves about what should be replacing, what should replace our 13 Confederation, so what replaces it? And interestingly, what they did has ripples downwards to the time of right now. So they built a system where you had two houses, one legislative chamber, one chamber of review. So the House of Reps and the Senate, and then you had the president. So in essence, three aspects of governing. And they built it in such a way that it was very hard to get anything through. Right? You needed consensus. You needed a majority.
Yeah.
Now, when they erected it, that was actually easy to do because they were all of the same class. They all had largely the same interests. They may have differed on particular things, but broadly speaking, they were of the same elite class. So it was very easy.
Because those were the only people who could vote.
Yeah. So it became much easier to do. Over time, now, and again, it's a simplistic view. There were fractures in that body that then erupted into war some 80 years later, 80 years ago, in the words of Abraham Lincoln.
That's right.
7 years ago, sorry. So ultimately, that there's those divisions. So yes, the elite aspect of it, that we're all the same, is true. But even then, the difference between the northern mercantile centers of power against the southern plantation centers of power, even that was even noticeable back then, that divide could fracture the way they'd set up the ability to pass laws and to govern. And it did. Now coming back to today, that level of consensus doesn't exist. It is so there are so many echo chambers of people listening to what they want to hear and grabbing that piece of information and believing it's true, means that the setup of the American Republic in terms of president, House of Reps, Senate it has a lot of dysfunction. As I said, deliberately inserted, but the logic of its insertion has broken down. So anyway, it's that whole aspect's fascinating. I'll probably discuss it for another time.
I keep thinking understatement, but then you fast forward even, and this is going to sound very kind of trivial, but it does represent kind of what we're talking about. During the Gilded Age, all of our newfound money because of the industrial age, and now Britain's aristocrats are struggling, their royals are struggling, and we've got all the money. So what did we do? We would send our socialites' daughters over to marry royals, like the Vanderbilts, and like we would take the Astors, we take them over there in order to get a title, because they still wanted some royal titles, and then they could get the money. So it hasn't even, it's like, I feel like the ink has hardly even dried. Of course it has, and then all of a sudden we're like kicking into gear with this whole other thing. So the history, what has been established continues, like this whole thing continues. And yet we're supposed to believe, we're good, they're bad. But I think every country is like that in a sense, but America, because we're trained, each man kind of for himself, it does become sort of this very self-focused, almost selfish kind of a thing. And we like the biggest, and I think that we're going to talk about that next when we talk about Pearl Harbor. It was important for us to feel like we're always the superpower. Like we're the superpower, the best, the best ever.
Manifest destiny. This notion that America is uniquely chosen in all the countries of the world to drive forth a particular vision. Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect, and as someone who's not American and looking into it from the outside, it's a fascinating mindset about this notion that we are in essence the best country in the world. We are the most paramount, and that manifest destiny does drive it. So very, that's it, interesting from our perspective.
Exactly, and. but I bring it up because I think now is the time where people are all of a sudden going, wait a second. Like for years we couldn't address that. And we have to, in just like I said, doing my little videos, especially my shorts, where I just poke. I mean, I do a lot of comedy. I'll talk about Benjamin Franklin having bodies in the basement of his London home. I just talk about funny things. But at the core of it is that there's some truth to some of this stuff, and people are fascinated with this and want to hear. But there are lies, and I'm trying to ask questions and prompt people to think. And I think we like to think that we are free thinkers, but the truth is that this aspect of logic and studying and not just taking things at face value, it's gone.